It's a hugely consequential election. I mean, it's the first time in 16 years that there's going to be a new chancellor.
The CDU, of course, has been in free fall for weeks now.
Now we need the stable conditions. We can change our systems.
Just days until the election in Europe's largest economy, and the only certainty is change. An end to Angela Merkel's 16 years as Chancellor. Now, Germany's major parties battle to succeed the EU's longest-serving leader. An election fought on pandemic recovery, climate policy, and foreign affairs. Whoever wins will oversee huge shifts as Germany's business community waits to see what the future could hold.
Hello everyone and welcome to Germany Decides, the chief executive briefing. With just 11 days to go until a monumental election in Germany, we're going to speak to 4 key leaders from the business world about what's at stake in this election. Now, do ask us a question if you're following on our webinar or on the Bloomberg terminal. You can always tweet us also at Bloomberg TV. Now, we have a fantastic panel of guests joining us. I'm excited. Speaking for the next hour, Christian Sewing, starting his career at Deutsche Bank in 1989 as an apprentice. He's now been the chief executive of Germany's largest lender since 2018. Also joining us, Professor Veronika Grimm, one of the member of Germany's Council of Economic Experts since April 2020. It's the country's most important advisory committee for matters of economic policy. Also, Christian Klein, starting at Europe's largest software company, SAP, as a student back in 1999 and has risen to become one of the continent's youngest chief executives. And Joe Kaeser, he is the chairman of the supervisory board of Siemens Energy and the incoming chairman of Daimler Trucks after a storied career in German business. So thank you all for joining us. We have 1 hour and we're going to talk about Germany. Christian Sewing, let me start off with you. Your stewardship at Deutsche Bank has really been known for restoring stability and cost cutting after some tumultuous years. What do you need from the next government?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's good to be with you this morning. Look, I think what we all miss a little bit in the whole election campaign is a clear outline of a European and German growth agenda for 2030. I do think that Germany has shown actually a tremendously good trajectory, in particular between 2010 and 2020. We benefited very much from our export industries. But we also know that even independent of COVID, the world is changing. The value chains are changing. We see geopolitical tensions. And therefore, I do think that what we need to now focus in order to maintain the growth, in order to maintain our competition and our competitive standing versus the US, but also in particular versus China, we need to have a clear European plan. That means one European home market for our corporate companies, for our industries. And I think in this European market, we need to put very much focus on the topic of sustainability, because I think that Europe has actually leading technologies that we can be at the forefront of that development. And if we get this right, combined with the Capital Markets Union, where we then also have the financing needs in place, which will certainly derive from all the investments needed for the topic of sustainability, Germany can actually be also in the next decade a leader in Europe and as such a competitive country globally. So a clear economic agenda, is that what I wish for?
Yeah, and that's exactly what we'll be talking about, you know, Europe, China, Capital Markets Union, and of course sustainability. Professor Grimm, your research includes market design, behavioral economics, energy markets. Is Germany really at the moment at the crossroads economically after 15 years of Angela Merkel?
Yeah, I think this is a very important election. We are in the middle of a deep transition due to everything we have to address in the context of climate change. We have challenges concerning, for example, our pension system. And there's a huge debate how we will manage to to take these challenges. I think it is true that we have to strengthen the EU's competitive position and to use also all the funds that have been set up now in order to cope with COVID and to recover, in order to strengthen the EU competitive position in the world, because there will be a deep transformation in our whole energy system. And this is a very important topic that is covered a lot in the German electoral debate. I think the debate is somehow too much focused on national thinking, but this might be due to the fact that there is also a change. Chancellor Merkel will not go forward anymore, and there is now the choice between three possible successors. So it's much about persons, the election.
Yeah, and we'll talk, Veronika, about some of the candidates shortly. But Christian Klein, you've overseen a strategic overhaul at SAP to focus more on emerging areas of growth like cloud computing. What do you think the state of German business is right now?
Yeah, first of all, I guess it's fair to say that under Angela Merkel's leadership, we achieved a lot. The unemployment rate is an all-time low. We also created over 6 million of new jobs. But clearly there is upside when we look at the digitization of Germany, but also Europe. I mean, my wish also for after the election is that we have a digital ministry, which also then results in the fact that we have 5G networks, not only for Germany, but across Europe, that we drive the digital transformation agenda, that we digitize, our public sector. Because especially now in the pandemic, we have seen how important it is that digital technologies make not only our enterprises more resilient, but also our public sector. And last but not least, Christian already mentioned it, how important sustainability is, but also in order to invest into sustainability and drive the agenda to become more carbon neutral, companies also need the money to invest. And that belongs together. And we can only be competitive also here in Europe if we also transform our industry. So these two things belong together. And this is why where is my wish that the new government really drives the digital agenda even more so in the future.
Kaeser, you've had a famed career in German business, overhauling the corporate structure, for example, at Siemens. I mean, what do chief executives want right now? What do you think will decide the election?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, the people will decide because they are going to vote and there will be majorities and then there will be coalitions. So that's the democratic process. Needless to say, at this time, it's a fantastic opportunity to bring our country into a more transformatory level. But as Christian said in the beginning, so far we haven't really discussed and talked a lot about content. I believe what we need, what Germany needs, is that we do have a comprehensive business plan for the next decade on how we are going to be inclusive of market economy in a transformatory environment, sustainability, and how we can make social inclusion a reality. I'm saying that because Germany has been doing really well in the last decade and the decades before. However, most of the German key industries, such as the car makers, tool making, healthcare, and others, are undergoing the most fundamental disruptive transformation in history. We call it the fourth industrial revolution, or Industry 4.0, or Internet of Things, you name it. So that needs a business plan, because there are conflicting topics there. Digitalization will boost productivity, will boost the time to market, means innovation. However, it will also divide society, because thousands of people, if not millions, will either lose the job or have to do different things in their job. So we need to have a plan, and that plan is missing. Now, obviously, it's election time. People are promising all kinds of stuff to get the vote. But the moment we have a coalition, we need to have a plan for the next 10 years on how we are going to be as successful as we used to be in the last 10 years. Otherwise, I'm afraid we are going to lose traction. And, the world will look at Germany, but the world is not waiting for Germany.
Joe, you talk about the business plan, so we'll get onto that in a second. But let's also take a look at the candidates vying to take over from Angela Merkel. The three parties that have been leading in the polls now facing off the debates are the SPD, Angela Merkel's CDU-CSU alliance, and the Greens. Now, the current finance minister, Olaf Scholz, leads the center-left Social Democrats. Scholz has really transformed his profile over the past 18 months to become the front-runner to succeed Angela Merkel, as he's been the face of the pandemic stimulus programs. Now, leading the conservative bloc is Armin Laschet. He's the state premier of Germany's most populous region, North Rhine-Westphalia, but he's suffered from high-profile gaffes during the summer flooding and has struggled to energize his party. And then leading the Greens is Annalena Baerbock. After her nomination as candidate for chancellor, the Greens were at 1 point leading in the polls, but despite the prominence of climate issues in the campaign, they've since slipped back into third place. If you look at some of the concerns, and Joe Kaeser was talking about the business plan, the energy and, of course, labor costs are among the highest in the world. What do you see, Christian Saving, as the #1 priority for any coalition? I don't know whether we need to start looking at best case scenario for business and worst case scenario, but it's very clear that there's something that needs to be re-energized.
Well, I think it's the overall discussion. What comes first? Is it kind of earning the GDP and increasing the GDP, or it's all about reallocation and distribution of money? And I do think that in case we want to maintain, and that must be our wish for Germany, to maintain the system of the so-called social economy which we drive here in Germany, we actually have to get back to the question, how can we ensure growth in this country over the next decade, knowing that the fundamentals in this world will change from a value chain point of view and so on. And therefore, I think the first thing we really need to focus is, again, how can Germany ensure that there is GDP growth in a good way and in a competitive way over the next 10 years? Therefore, we need to invest. In order to invest, you need to have 2 or 3 things. We should really reduce, in particular in Germany, the way of bureaucracy. We have far too much bureaucracy in Germany. We need swifter and more decisive action and decisions, in particular also by the public authorities. Secondly, I think Germany cannot go for any kind of tax increases. I know that the last 1.5 years were burdensome on the public debt. Nevertheless, Germany fared well, and I think we have to do everything, not in order to increase tax. We already have in Germany, compared to other OECD countries, the highest tax ratio, and therefore we should not further increase, but actually leave the power and the capacities within the private sector to invest. Thirdly, given the investments needed for the sustainability change which we will see and the transformation which we see over the next 10 years, we need to actively work that we get the investments into Europe, the investments into the country. And we can only do that with an open and deep capital markets like we see it in the US. If you work on these 3 items, I do believe that despite the fact you are rightly quoting out that Germany has high labor costs, that we have high electricity costs, actually we will work with those investments again on our technology, we will work on our efficiencies, and that was the way Germany always overcame the structural issues of higher labor costs. And that's what we need to maintain, and hence the focus on growth in the next 10 years. And what Joe is saying, having a clear business plan for that, for Germany and Europe, is essential to maintain the competitive situation we're in.
Christian Saving, who's the best chancellor for this? You've laid out the concerns, you've laid out actually solutions also that you would put in place for the next government. Is there a coalition, is there a chancellor that would do a much better job with this?
Look, first of all, and in my view, that is an issue in Germany for the time being. We are too much focusing on individual people. I think we should focus really on the underlying theme and priority of the parties. And there, you know what I just said, less bureaucracy, a clear tax system which is not further disadvantaging us. I do think that we need a government which has this economic agenda on top of its priority. And in this regard, I have to tell you, we have 3 candidates who are debating on TV. Actually, in my view, there is a 4th party missing in that debate, and that's the Liberal Party, because there is obviously a clear agenda for growth. And therefore, I do think one has to go look into the underlying programs of the party rather than only focusing on the candidates. Each of those candidates, to be very honest, has his or her merits, absolutely. We have somebody who has shown in North Rhine-Westphalia that he can transfer a kind of an old economy into a new economy. We have seen a finance minister who has lots of experience. We have a Green Party who stands a lot for the new generation. But what you need to do is you need to look into the underlying themes of the programs of the parties, and then you get, in my view, the right answer when it comes to the top priority, and that is economic growth.
Veronika, I mean, it seems that German voters at the moment are really facing a bewildering array of possible coalitions. Is there going to be tactical voting? Again, this feels like an election where anything could happen, really.
Yeah, that is very difficult to say. I think basically the topics are on the table, and it is important to pursue a certain agenda that that enables us to transform our whole economy towards climate neutrality. And the proposals are on the table. I think in the past there have been quite ambitious initiatives. The recent climate laws, the hydrogen strategy that Germany and the EU pursued. But now we need to get into the making to strengthen the incentives for climate neutral business models. We need to build up infrastructure and reduce bureaucracy in order to speed these processes up. And all the parties have these proposals in their programs, but they have in some dimensions quite different perspectives, how really to get into this making. Whether people vote strategically, it's very hard to say. The polls are interesting, but the polls are not all. In the end, it will matter what the people are deciding.
Mr. Klein, I was reminded, of course, preparing for this, that SAP was founded in 1972 by 5 entrepreneurs who had 1 customer. What kind of advice would you have for someone who wants to break through in that space, visionary software, for example, specialists in Germany in 2021, and how can the next government help that person?
I mean, for sure, what we also have seen in Germany during the pandemic, that there's upside in the digital education. I mean, when you look at across our states, a lot of kids really suffered from the lack of quality of our infrastructure, digital infrastructure in this country. And this also comes back that we need in Germany a digital ministry who actually leads to the fact that we can also educate our kids in a digital way, that we change our curriculums, because Joe mentioned it, all of our leading industries are undergoing a massive transformation. I mean, look at the automotive industry. A car in the future has much more software and technology embedded as in the past. And we need to equip our next generation with exactly those skills. That's the strength of Germany. This is how we're gonna stay competitive. So and this is the one hand side. The other hand is also that we create incentives for entrepreneurs, that we also make sure that here in Berlin, in Munich, in all of our communities, that it's also able to find enough money to actually fulfill your vision, to go into new businesses and to allow our people to also grow the next generation enterprises like SAP. And this is also clearly where we have upside, better R&D, better incentives for R&D, better incentives for our startups community in this country.
Joe, I know you've been frustrated in the past, you know, or you've urged policymakers to focus long-term instead of focusing on the next election. Is there a danger that also because of the pandemic, because of supply chain issues, because of the Delta variant and possible other variants, you know, all the politicians in Germany that will come into power will be too short-term, and what can be done about that?
Well, that's what I was saying, that we need a 10 years plan, and typically, you know, legislation or the parliament takes 4 years. The first year is to get to know each other. Then we have 2 years left to get something done, and the 4th year is already election campaigning again. That's not what innovation cycles and long-term planning is about, what companies do. So that's why we need a real business plan for our country. And a business plan for our country will definitely not just include how can we foster growth in Germany. That's not on the agenda because really, honestly, or it should be on the agenda, but not in the first place. Because look, in Germany, no matter whether our GDP grows 1 or 2 or 3%, all those technology matters, digitization, transformation, that will actually, the fourth industrial revolution, that will offer productivity potential 10, 15, 20%. So no matter what we do in Germany, we need to get our export model going. So that means foreign policy in Germany is foreign economic policy in Germany. And that, having that in mind, we need to take it one step up and say, okay, fine, what does it take to make the export model, continue into the next 10 years? First is innovation, definitely innovation. And that's what we can do as a country, as companies. That's on our side, foster innovation. But then we also need to go look, what do things like in Southeast Asia, predominantly China, secondly, United States, what does the decoupling do to Germany? If a decoupling forces localization, then our country looks pretty dark in the future. So we need to actually step up into a European foreign economic policy, drive that so that we are on equal footage between China, the United States, and Europe if it comes to global trade rules and other things. So that's, I think, what we have at stake. German foreign policy with foreign economic policy, really important. You asked about the polls and the potential coalitions. Look, the pollers have not been exactly known in the past for being accurate. So I would say nobody knows. There's about 25% of the German voters who are not yet, decisive on what they want to do. For me, I believe the most likely outcome is potentially this, what they call the traffic light coalition with the Social Democrats, the Free Democrats, and the Greens. Obviously, now neither the Social Democrats nor the Greens will let's say that they cannot do the rhetoric green because it's a tactical issue they have to keep till last minute in order to make the Free Democrats willing to a coalition. So time will tell. But what I'm trying to say is, no matter what government we have, we need to have a long-term plan, including market economy, fostering innovation, including sustainability, which I think is very, very attractive because this is about innovation and global pollution reduction. And thirdly, and this is really, really important, how can we include society and make sure that the society does not get further divided, because we do need social freedom and social peace in order to make matters work.
Joe, let me remind all of our viewers far and wide, actually, some of what the economic facts for Germany. Angela Merkel was a stable presence overseeing the German economy despite being in charge during two major recessions, the global financial crisis and, of course, this pandemic. Now, this economic shock from coronavirus upended years of German fiscal policy, ending Merkel's balanced budget regime to unleash hundreds of billions of euros in aid. Now debate rages among the parties over the emphasis on public spending and investment once the crisis is over versus returning to balanced budgets. Christian Saving, I want to spend a bit of time, looking at this, exploring this with you and what kind of banking industry Europe and Germany needs. How different will banks look in 3-4 years? I know you've called for a capital markets union, a banking union. What happens if we don't get it in our lifetime?
Well, we will get it in our lifetime. So I'm that clear. It must happen. It will happen. And to be honest, if you look across the various parties, the democratic parties, if you look also into other European countries, the capital markets union will come. The question is when and how swift does it come? Look, to your chart, which you just showed, I do think, and praise to Germany. They have done very well over the last 10 years, in particular with regard to debt to GDP. I mean, in this regard, we are leading. But we also understand, and that must be the understanding of any new government, that simply the spending, which we had to do through the pandemic, and I think where the government actually reacted very well and very swiftly, we need to stop that. And that is also something which the society needs to understand, that the expectation that the country will take care in terms of distribution, a new deficit budget, must come to an end. And therefore, the key question is, how can we incentivize and how can we make it happen that private investments are actually going up? And here I come to the point you are making. Here it is the way of the Capital Markets Union. This is how can we better canalize and actually allocate investments into Europe, into Germany. And for that, we need a deeper capital markets. And why? Not only because public spending should be obviously limited. And I think we really need to come off the drug which we have seen for the last 1.5 years. But the real issue is, if you look at the investments for sustainability over the next years, it's per year 2 billion euros just for the European Union. And that cannot be done via public spending. That cannot be only done via the balance sheet of the banks, but it must be done via a deeper and bigger capital markets. That's what we need, and that actually gives us one more chance. Because if you have a deeper capital market, this also provides the chance that we have investments into venture capital. That's exactly what we see in the US. And that also means that the chances to invest into new technologies, into new business models, are higher to come to Germany and to Europe. And therefore, I do believe we need to understand that we need to reduce the public spending, the deficit making, move into the private investments, private bet, and therefore into the Capital Markets Union. That's on the agenda which we need to now work on.
But Christian, is there a danger that actually after, we've also had Brexit, which means that Germany doesn't have the kind of sparing partner that it's had in the past when it comes to regulation and banking. Is there a danger that whoever's in charge next doesn't focus on this and so kind of leaves German banks to wither away?
Look, I do think, first of all, it's our role to make it very clear that we as banks need a competitive environment. We have done that. And I also would like to say that over the last 3 or 4 years, also with the finance ministry we have here in Germany, we got the support which we needed in order to make sure that the financial industry is at the core of the overall economy in Germany and in Europe. And I think we have shown it through the pandemic. I'm really glad that during the pandemic, banks were part of the solution and not part of the problem, like in the financial crisis 2007, 2008. And that's our expectation, that we maintain that. For that, we need level playing field. We need to make sure that issues, as you're just saying, that, for instance, the introduction of Basel IV is kind of more tailor-made for the underlying industry in Germany. You know that our backbone is the Mittelstand. For that, we need tailor-made regulations in order to stay competitive. But I have to tell you, I do think that the German finance ministry, also regulators, understand that if we now push it a little bit more and we get even a better grip on this, while at the same time the banks are doing the homework, which we have done, and further increase the trust in our robustness, I do think that we will get the support that everybody knows banks are key for the transformation for the next 10 years. So I'm optimistic here.
Veronika Grimm, do you think austerity should be history? Joe, jump in and then a question.
Francine,
go ahead.
Because, Christian cannot really say it. I mean, not all the banks have done their homework in Germany. And firstly and secondly, there has been a lot of headwind for the banks in Germany, to get on a level playing field with the competitors in Europe and elsewhere in the world. Christian has done a fascinating job getting Deutsche back into play. But I really, really do wish that the new government in Germany understands better what needs to be done to help the banks, rather than to put a lot of stuff into their way of becoming a reliable long-term partner to the industry.
Joe, are you suggesting consolidation, or are you just talking about regulation?
I'm just saying that, as I said, Deutsche Bank has done a fascinating job to come back from a pretty screwed up bank to a trustful long-term partner again, and I mean what I say, and that's been the leadership of Christian. But by the same token, there's been a lot of headwinds, in Germany for the banks to get their stuff together. I'm not saying or suggesting there's got to be consolidation. I'm suggesting that Germany and the German government looks more after their banking as they look after, let's say, the Mittelstand or the industry, because we do need to have reliable banking as a prerequisite, as a foundation of doing business, giving credit, also to venture capital and the likes. And if you have to put a lot of equity, on your balance sheet to support venture capital and startups, it's not going to be that easy. So we've got to have, a lot of reform taking also in the financial sector to foster innovation, to foster entrepreneurship, so that the banks can help and be an active partner in bringing that up to a level which is known, let's say, in the United States or elsewhere in the world.
Yeah. Veronika Grimm, I see you nodding, so maybe a comment on the banks, and then I also want to ask you whether you think austerity is a thing of the past or should be a thing of the past.
I think it is very important to mobilize private investment. So in our economies, around 84% of investment is private investment. So the private sector will be key for the transformation for that reason, because it's just the largest part of investment that's being taken. And the second issue is that the German and the European industry is in an excellent position to provide technologies and solutions for sustainable digitalized economies worldwide. But currently, I think the state has to do a lot of homework, because the regulatory environment is not really fostering innovation in the way it should be fostering innovation. One issue is bureaucracy. The other issue is that the relative prices are not the right ones. So fossil business models are still much more profitable than climate neutral business models. And there is a lag in building up infrastructure. And this is something, of course, the state has to coordinate and to plan, but not to pay entirely. So I think the state should do its homework, adapt the framework conditions under which innovation and success of the economy can take place. But I also think that the state should not weaken working effective fiscal rules, because that it comes with a danger that the public money is not spent for what we think it's spent for. On the one hand, there might be mechanisms that, in the end, for example, if a reform of the pension model is delayed further, and other issues. And the second thing is that the more the state plans to decide, the more difficult it becomes, because there's no consensus in which is the transformation path, how the economy should actually transform in the direction of a digitalized and climate neutral economy. A lot of technological process will determine what are the best solutions. And this is something that is better organized in a decentralized way, enabling firms to contribute and to find out the best solution. And it's not oriented on what, for example, Germany needs, but it should be oriented on what the world needs, what solutions does the world need, because we are an exporting country, so we have a huge export orientation, and this will also switch. We will not anymore export fossil cars, for example, but we will have to switch this, and I think it is very important that we create a framework that enables firms to go in these directions and to be successful in future markets.
Veronika Grimm, let's talk a little bit about climate. So it's been, of course, one of the key issues in the election, with devastating floods in July, just the latest reminder of the risks that countries face. And here's what the candidates have been saying on the issue.
We should be as successful as we were in the 19th century with this industrial breakthrough. And this could be the case with electric mobility. This could be the case also with renewable energies. And it will be a decade of high private investment and high public investment.
We have to make sure that the private capital that is at our disposal in Germany is also mobilized and made available.
If you restrict investments in a crisis, you really get to the edge of the existence of a social welfare state with dramatic consequences. And though far within this crisis, we have to invest into the future.
Many people are calling for climate neutrality, but I want us also to still be an industrialized country in 20 or 30 years, to still have industrial jobs.
Those were the candidates on climate. Now, some of the traditional German industries have a large CO2 footprint. So, Christian Klein, if we look at some of the sectors that will see the deepest, of course, disruption as the result of these ambitious goals, how difficult will it be for the next government to manage the transition?
Yeah, indeed. That's actually a very valid point. I mean, these days we see that governments across the world, but also enterprises have really come out with new sustainability goals. But actually, it's also part of the truth that we are really also today lacking the transparency. How high is actually the carbon footprint, for example, of an electric car? Because the carbon footprint doesn't only happen within the four walls of a car manufacturer. It actually, it's created across the supply chain. And this is why, and this is also a unique opportunity for Europe, to create strong B2B platforms where we not only connect the car manufacturers with the suppliers, with the logistic providers, to really create a digital supply chain and build more resilient supply chain, but also to track and trace the carbon footprint, for example, to have this transparency and then to take tailored action. And this is very much needed. And that also then leads back that we really need to lead with our digital agenda to create this B2B platform. Just look at the power of all the B2C platforms coming from the US. And we in Europe, we have a very strong car industry. And now we need to use this expertise, come together on this platform, share data, digitize our information flows, and with that also make sustainability more reportable, and with that, for example, in the case of carbon footprint, create more transparency and take decisive action and not only put new targets out there.
Joe, Tesla is also building a factory really on the home turf of some of the biggest car makers in the world. Who will lose out in this push for green?
Well, look, time will tell. Obviously, Tesla has had the benefit that it was a greenfield approach. They had no legacy. The German car makers and of course others, they had the legacy of having combustion engines, and as the profit makers, and now they need to transform into a totally new way of mobility. And somebody said it earlier, the car of the future is an operating system on wheels. That's in essence what it's going to be. And so therefore there will be a huge transformation. And, for example, the German car makers, they need to manage that transformation out of a legacy, which is always hard if you have a disruptive transformation. So that's why I believe there is a lot at stake. We've seen some very good movements on the car makers in Germany on their targets, but time will tell on how they're going to do this. So therefore, I think the race is open on that matter, and may the best team win. But in order to make the best team win, we need to have a level playing field on the rules and regulations on a global scale. That's really important on the whole climate matter. I'll give you an example. Germany has about 800 megatons of CO2 emission, okay? The global CO2 emission is 40 gigatons. So that means Germany has got 2% of the global CO2 emission.
Yeah.
Now, if you focus all your policy making on getting, let's say, from 2% to 1% of global emission, that's not going to work. That's not going to cut it. Because if it takes 4 or 5 years till we get there. In the meantime, Indonesia, Philippines, all the Asian developing economies, potentially Africa, they will by far emit more than this 1% global thing. So that means the key decisive element of German industry is how can we push innovation as much so that we can export goods and services which help the greater good of CO2 emission globally, and not just in Germany. And that's missing in the German political debate. That's why I come back to my topic. We need a business plan over 10 years, not just 4 years, not a political program. We need to have a long-term plan, including innovation, including the German export model, including a European approach to global trade, and of course, last but not least, including the social divide of an elderly population in Germany.
I'm getting quite a lot of viewer questions, actually, on climate change. Veronika, maybe this is one for you. In the face of the current energy crisis, how sensible is it to turn off 3 of Germany's nuclear power plants this year?
I think we have to accept that Germany has decided it this way, to turn off nuclear first and then to exit coal. It could be a difficult debate in our society to open this up again. So I think we should go forward. We should go in the direction to enable our industry to develop the solutions that enable countries worldwide to become climate neutral. That should be the agenda. That's a very globalized, very international agenda. And this is on the one hand, a policy that should focus on the industrial development, on the innovation, and on the other hand, we have to cooperate. We have to initiate global cooperations. At the moment, we import 70% of our primary energy in the form of fossil fuels, gas, oil, coal, and this will change within the next decades. We will import electricity on the one hand, very likely, but also other energy carriers that are based on hydrogen. And these will be a completely new supply chains that we have to set up, cooperating with countries, which allows us to diversify our energy dependency, to just set it up in a new way, but which allows us also to provide all the technologies that are needed to produce hydrogen and synthetic energy carriers, climate neutral synthetic energy carriers worldwide, to transport them to Europe or to countries worldwide. And this will be also a huge technological project that we should foster. And these things are starting out. I think that's the agenda that we should pursue, and not going back into a debate whether to prolong nuclear energy or, of course, we should exit coal earlier than planned. But I think this will happen anyhow due to the higher CO2 prices that we already observe.
Christian Sewing, I have to ask you, of course, about some of the probes, relating into financial services, relating to asset managers. How much of an impression did the DWS probes make on asset management industries as a whole? And what are the wider ramifications when it comes to green or greenwashing?
Well, first of all, I mean, if you ask me directly, DWS brought out a clear statement rejecting all the allegations. Clearly referring to the annual report. And I have to say, with the business development I have seen there, actually also now with analysts coming out, looking at DWS, looking at these items, actually supporting DWS and further recommending it, I think this is a very strong statement. Now, we all have to take into account, and that is not only for asset managers, the whole sustainability and ESG, and in particular taxonomy, is an evolving issue where also we learn and develop from month to month. And in this regard, I think we all, banks around the world, asset managers, work on a taxonomy, have high standards. I mean, if I look at Deutsche Bank, if I look at what we are doing to categorize all the transactions, to have a separate and independent review panel in order to review individual transactions, whether this falls under sustainability or not. That is huge work. There is very diligent work, and therefore I feel comfortable that we go into the right direction. But as we said on our Sustainability Day in May, we are coming actually from ambition to impact. So it's a very developing topic. Let me say one word to sustainability, because you had another graph out there where you said the individual parties by which year they would like to be carbon neutral, 2045, 2050. I think it's very important that on the whole journey, and Joe was referring to that on the whole journey to carbon neutrality, you need to take the people with you on that journey. And therefore, when you think about ESG, it's, of course, the focus is on E. But let's never forget the S. And that is the social impact of that transformation, in particular for parts of the industries which are not yet obviously carbon neutral. And therefore, we need to have not only the business plan Joe is asking for, but a clear transformation timeline over the next 5 to 10 years in order to have also the people's backing that this way it's worth to go, and that at the end of the day, this way is not all about risk, but it could be an opportunity for Germany and for Europe. And therefore, whenever we talk about environment, let's also talk about the S part, because the one does not go without the other.
Yeah. Okay, let's also talk about China now. Foreign policy, and in particular relations with China, is a key issue, of course, for the next government. Germany's export-driven economy has seen increasing trade with the world's second-largest economy, but reliance on China raises the risk of being caught in the middle if tensions between Washington and Beijing escalate again. Christian Saving, when you look at what Angela Merkel tried to do, it's a bit of a balance with China, sometimes standing up to Beijing a little bit, but at the same time cultivating trade links to benefit the German industry. Do you see China more as a threat or an opportunity?
Look, to be very honest, I mean, as you rightly says, we are somewhere in the middle. Both markets, the US and China, are key for Germany. It is both markets are an opportunity for Germany. And therefore, I have to say the politic and the strategy and the way, in particular, Angela Merkel worked with China over the last years, and I had the opportunity actually to join her for one trip, is exemplary. I really do think she tried to find the right balance. On the one hand, clearly calling out those issues which are not in line with our values, but on the other hand, also trying to foster our business relationship. There is one other point, and again, we said that before. We need China, we need the US. And I think for that, in order to make it even more forceful for us, I think Europe needs to have one bigger home market. If we can actually have one European agenda, and with that, we can also portray that better to China as well as to the US, it is of the benefit for whole of Europe. And therefore, we shouldn't argue from a one-country perspective, but actually use the power and the capacity and the capability Europe has.
But Joe Kaeser, how much more difficult will this be, this balancing act, right, for the success of Angela Merkel, given that the US, both under Trump and Biden, has been much more aggressive towards the country?
Well, look, I believe the dialogue with China and other complicated economies, let me put it this way, it's been probably one of the biggest achievements of our current Chancellor, Angela Merkel. She's always been a strong advocate about talking to each other and not about each other. So she's been going to countries and address the issues, but also been looking for solutions altogether. And as Christian Saving rightfully said, you know, Germany, as much as I love my country, is way too small to play on an equal footage with China and the United States. So we need to have a joint European foreign economic policy, a set of rules, so that we can discuss on level with the other two big powers in the world. Now, obviously, if it comes to China and the United States, I mean, look, the US currently is the #1 economic force in the world. A lot of people say China will take over in a few years. So if you're #1 in a field, you don't like to be #2 tomorrow. So there is obviously a competition about the #1 in the world. That's just we don't need to be naive. And the issue is we must not be caught in the middle. And therefore, dialogue between the EU, China, and the US about global trade rules is essential in nature. Because if we really get into an issue where we, see a continued decoupling between, let's say, the China-led world, and there's a lot of countries, in the Belt and Road Initiative, and the US-led world, this is not going to be good, because that decoupling means for global companies or export-oriented countries like Germany that we need to further localize. So that means, for example, Siemens or SAP or others, or Volkswagen, we need to build factories in China and we need to build factories in the US. Right. So that means localizing into the markets. We are Chinese, we are US. So that's how big companies overcome the decoupling. Now let me think about the German Mittelstand, a very, very important area they can't afford to build more factories in China or the US. So they're going to be caught in the middle by that decoupling. So priority number one of the new German government is to foster the European foreign economic policy and find a global set of trade rules on how we can overcome the competition between Buy American and invest in China.
And that's, Joe, exactly where I wanted to go, right? Europe is not, doesn't have Apple. We don't have Google. We don't have Alibaba. Christian Klein, do you, worry that actually the region, and therefore Germany, will fall behind, for example, in future technologies like AI?
No, but Joe said it absolutely right. At the end, also we in Germany rely on a strong Europe. If we coming together in Europe and build strong B2B platforms, we can actually set a standard in the automotive industry. If we are now, building, for example, we just founded Catena X with Volkswagen, with Mercedes, with BMW, with Siemens. And when we are setting this standard and building this digital supply chain, I mean, the Chinese, the companies in the US, they will join, and we have the opportunity, but only if we come together, as one in Europe. And then on top, I mean, we are running large multinationals, and in the US, they are doing business in China, and vice versa. And of course, also here in Europe, we are doing a lot of business with China, and of course, also with the US. And with the current political tensions actually increasing, of course, this is imposing a lot of additional burden in localization requirements, in data isolation. And at the end, there is no win-win. And this is why I can also only applaud our Chancellor Merkel, who really always tried to build bridges and not going back into isolation, because there is no winner in that. And again, for us in Germany, it's so important that we are tackling this as Europe, as really one region.
Yeah, Veronika, I guess $1 million question is, what's the best way to tackle, though, the competitive threat from China? Is it, for help from the state to confront this threat, or Washington-style free market consensus?
I think it is definitely strengthening the European Union, the European single market, the European capital markets union, and to make the EU a strong economic area. The stronger Europe is, the more likely it is that we also win others in order to go in certain directions in a cooperative way. For example, in climate protection, cooperation will be key. So we have to initiate initiatives, and Angela Merkel did this from the beginning of their chancellery to try to strive in this direction. We have to initiate initiatives for global climate cooperation. This will make it more easy for everyone to promote technologies to transform the economy. I think it will be a little bit difficult to decide on what we cooperate. A common CO2 price would be desirable, but I expect that the US will not introduce a CO2 price in the near future, but we could also cooperate in other ways. So I think cooperation in climate protection will be key. And then there will, of course, be a competition between the different regions who succeeds in development of technologies, who succeeds economically. But this interplay of cooperation and competition will be key in the future as well.
All right, well, thank you so much for a very insightful panel. I wish we had more time, but that was the hour. Thank you so much to our guests, Christian Saving, Professor Veronika Grimm, Christian Klein, and Joe Kaeser. Now that's it for Germany Decides, the Chief Executive Briefing. Our special coverage of the German election continues, of course, on Election Day on Sunday, September 26. We'll bring you live coverage as polls close and then results start to come in. Coming up, we'll have plenty more on market coverage. Of course, we'll also look at the German election as it withstands with the Commission. We've had some updates also on energy consumption. This is Bloomberg.